think we're live. Let's make this 144p so it doesn't mess with me. I think we're on chapter 9. Copy. Let's see what this looks like. All right. I'm not. Yeah, I'll put it on Facebook, see if people want to check it out. Okie doke. This is good. That's good. Okay. That's good. Let's find chapter 9. It's been a minute since I've been able to read. There's chapter 13. Ooh. I think we're close. Chapter 9. Ooh, Virginia. Okay. Hopefully I don't get a lot of extra noise in this from upstairs. I need a studio. Chapter 9. Virginia, the First Charter. The first settlers at Jamestown were idle and improvident. Only 12 of those who came in 1607 were common laborers. There were 4 carpenters in the company, 6 or 8 masons and blacksmiths, and a long list of gentlemen. If necessity had not soon driven these to toil, the colony must have perished. The few married men had left their families in England. The affairs of the colony were badly managed. King James had made out sealed instructions, and the names of the governor and members of the council were unknown during the voyage. In this state of misrule, Captain John Smith, the best man in the colony, was suspected of making a plot to murder the council and to make himself king of Virginia. He was arrested and confined until the end of the voyage. When at last the colonists reached their destination, the king's instructions were unsealed and the names of the inferior council made known. A meeting was held and Edward Wingfield elected first governor of Virginia. Smith was now charged with sedition and excluded from the council. But when it was found that his enemies could bring nothing against him, he was restored to his place. As soon as the settlement was well begun, Smith and Newport, with 20 others, explored James River for 45 miles. Just below the falls, near the present site of Richmond, the explorers found the capital of Powhatan, the Indian king. But the city was only a squalid village of 12 wigwams. The monarch received the foreigners with courtesy and showed no dislike at the intrusion. The company returned to Jamestown, and on the 15th of June, Newport embarked for England. The colonists now began to realize their situation. They were alone in the New World. Winter was approaching. Dreadful diseases broke out in the settlement, and the colony was brought almost to ruin. At one time, only 5 men were able to go on duty as sentinels. Gosnold died, and before the middle of September, 1/2 of the colonists had been swept off by the malady. But the frosts of autumn came and the ravages of disease were checked. Civil dissension was added to the other calamities. President Wingfield and George Kendall were detected in embezzling the stores of the colony and were removed from office. Ratcliffe was then chosen president but was found incompetent. Only Martin and Smith now remained in the council, and by common consent the latter took charge of the colony. The new president was an Englishman by birth, a soldier, a traveler, and a hero. Under his administration, the new settlement soon began to show signs of progress. His first care was to improve the buildings of the plantation. Just 1 second. Make sure we're good here. Okay, we're good. We're good. All right. Find where we're at. The next measure was to secure a supply of provisions. There had been a plentiful harvest among the Indians, but the work of procuring corn was not an easy task. Descending James River to Hampton Roads, Smith landed with 5 companions and offered the natives hatchets and copper coins in exchange for corn. The Indians only laughed at the proposal and mocked the foreigners by offering a piece of bread for Smith's sword and musket. The English then charged on the wigwams and found an abundant store of corn. A parley ensued, and the warriors were obliged to purchase peace by loading the boats of the English, who then rowed up the river to Jamestown. Soon the Indians in the neighborhood of the settlement began to come into the fort with voluntary contributions. The fear of famine passed away. The woods were full of wild turkeys. Good discipline was maintained in the colony, and friendly relations were established with the natives. Seeing the end of their distress, the colonists became cheerful and happy. As soon as winter set in, the president, with 6 Englishmen and 2 Indian guides, began to explore the country on the Chickahominy. It was believed by the people of Jamestown that by going up the stream, they could reach the Pacific Ocean. Smith knew the absurdity of such an opinion, but humored it because of the opportunity which it gave him to explore new territory. The rest might dig for gold dust and hunt for the Pacific. He would see the country and make maps. The president and his companions ascended the river until it dwindled to a mere creek, winding about the woods and meadows. The men who were left to protect the boats were attacked by the Indians, and several of the English were killed. Smith was at last discovered, wounded with an arrow, and chased through the woods. He fought, ran, and fired by turns, stumbled into a morass, and was finally overtaken. The savages were wary of their antagonist until he laid down his gun and was pulled out of the mire. Smith demanded to see the Indian chief, and on being taken into his presence, excited his curiosity by showing him a pocket compass and a watch. These instruments struck the Indians with awe, but the savages grew tired of trifling, bound their captive to a tree, and prepared to shoot him. At the critical moment, he flourished his compass in the air, and the Indians were afraid to fire. But the danger of torture was yet to be avoided. Smith was next taken to Orapax, a few miles from the site of Richmond. Here he found the Indians making preparations to attack and destroy Jamestown. They invited him to become their leader, but he refused and managed to write a letter to his countrymen, telling them of their peril. This letter, which seemed to the Indians to have a mysterious power of carrying intelligence, frightened them more than ever. When the warriors arrived at Jamestown and found everything as Smith had said, their terror knew no bounds. And as soon as they returned, all thought of attacking the colony was given up. The Indians now marched their captive about from village to village. Near the fork of York River, they came to Pamunkey, the capital of Opechancano. Here Smith was turned over to the priests, who assembled in their long house for 3 days, danced around him, sang and yelled after the manner of their superstition. The object was to determine by his wild ceremony what his fate should be. The decision was against him, and he was condemned to death. Smith was next taken down the river to a town where Powhatan lived in winter. The savage monarch was now 60 years of age. He received the prisoner with all the formalities peculiar to his race. Clad in a robe of raccoon skins, he took his seat in the long house. His 2 daughters sat near him, and warriors and women were ranged all around the hall. The king reviewed the cause and confirmed the sentence of death. 2 large stones were brought into the hall. Smith was dragged forth, bound, and his head put into position to be crushed with a war club. A painted savage was ordered out of the rank and stood ready. The signal was given. The executioner raised his club, and another moment had decided the fate of the captive and his colony. But in that moment, Matonka, the eldest daughter of Powhatan, rushed between the warrior's club and the prostrate prisoner. She clasped his head in her arms and held on until her father, yielding her appeals, ordered Smith to be unbound. Again he was rescued from a terrible death. There's a side note for the name Matoka. Powhatan's tribe had a superstition that a person whose real name was unknown could not be injured. They therefore told the English falsely that Matoka's name was Pocahontas. Powhatan decided that the prisoner should remain in his household and make toys for his daughter. Soon, however, it was agreed that he should return to Jamestown. He was liberated on condition that he should send back the Orapaks 2 cannons and a grindstone. Certain warriors accompanied Smith to the settlement where, under pretense of teaching them gunnery, he had the cannons loaded with stones and discharged among the treetops. There was a terrible crash, and the savages feared to touch the dreadful engines, returned to their king with neither guns nor grindstones. Only 38 of the settlers were now alive and were frostbitten and half-starved. Their leader had been absent for 7 weeks in the middle of winter. The old fears of the colonists had revived, and when Smith returned, he found all hands preparing to abandon the settlement. With much persuasion, he induced the majority to abandon this project, but the rest, burning with resentment against him, made a conspiracy to kill him. In these days, Newport arrived from England, bringing a store of supplies and 120 immigrants. But the newcomers gave no promise of good. They were gentlemen, gold hunters, jewelers, engravers, adventurers, and strollers. Smith was much vexed at this, for he had urged Newport to bring over only a few industrious mechanics and laborers. As soon as the weather would permit, the newcomers and some of the old settlers began to stroll about the country digging for gold. In a bank of sand at the mouth of a small creek, some glittering particles were found, and the whole settlement was thrown into excitement. Martin and Newport filled one of the ships with the supposed gold dust and sent it to England. Soon afterward, a company sailed up James River to find the Pacific Ocean. 14 weeks of springtime were consumed in this nonsense. Even the Indians ridiculed the madness of men who were wasting their chances for a crop of corn. In the midst of this general folly, Smith formed the design of exploring the Chesapeake Bay and its tributaries. Accompanied by Dr. Russell and 13 others, he left Jamestown on the 2nd day of June. In an open barge, he steered boldly out by way of Hampton Roads as far as Smith's Island. Returning thence around Cape Charles, the survey of the eastern shore of the bay was begun, and continued northward as far as the river Wicomico. From this point, the expedition crossed over to the Patuxent, and thence northward along the western side to the Patapsco. Here some of the company became disoriented, and insisted on returning to the colony. Smith consented, but in steering southward had the good fortune to enter the mouth of the Potomac. Pleased with the prospect, the crew returned the barge upstream and continued the voyage as far as the falls at Georgetown. Tired of adventure, they then dropped down the river to the bay and reached Jamestown on the 21st of July. After a rest of 3 days, a second voyage was begun. This time the expedition reached the head of the bay and sailed far up the Susquehanna. Here the Indians were of gigantic stature and fierce disposition. On the return voyage, Smith explored every sound and inlet of any note as far as the Rappahannock. This stream he ascended to the head of the navigation, and then returned to Jamestown. He had been absent a little more than 3 months and had explored the coast of the Great Bay for fully 3,000 miles. He had been driven about by storms, once wrecked, once stung by a poisonous fish, and brought so near to death that his comrades digged his grave. Now he was come back to the colony with a map of the Chesapeake, which he sent by Newport to England, and which is still preserved. Smith was now formally elected president. Soon there was a marked change for the better. Gold hunting ceased, and the rest of the year was noted as a time of prosperity. In the autumn, Newport arrived with 70 additional immigrants. The health was so good that only 7 deaths occurred between September and the following May. Every well man was obliged to work 6 hours a day. New houses were built, new fields fenced in, and through the winter, the sound of axe and hammer gave token of a prosperous and growing village. Recapitulation. Bad character of the first settlers. Necessity drives them to labor. The king gives sealed instructions. Smith is arrested, restored to his place in the council. He and Newport explore the James. Newport goes to England. The colonists are discouraged. Disease ravages the settlement. Gosnold dies. Wingfield embezzles the funds, is removed from office. Ratcliffe succeeds and is impeached. Smith takes control of the colony. Sketch of his life. The settlement flourishes. Smith procures supplies. The Indians bring provisions. Smith explores the Chickahominy, is captured by the Indians, saves his life by stratagem, is carried out to Orapax, is condemned to death, and saved by Pocahontas, is liberated, returns to Jamestown, terrifies the savages. Deplorable condition of the settlement, plot to abandon the place. Newport arrives with new immigrants, as bad as the others. The gold hunters go abroad and find mica in the sand, a shipload of dirt sent to England. The planting season goes by. Smith makes his exploration of the Chesapeake, returns, is elected president. Newport arrives with immigrants and supplies. Progress of the colony. Oops, all right, let me make a marker here. All right. Here we go. Chapter 10, Virginia, the Second Charter. On the 23rd day of May, 1609, King James granted to the London Company a new charter, by which the government of Virginia was completely changed. The territory was extended from Cape Fear to Sandy Hook, and westward to the Pacific Ocean. The members of the Superior Council were now to be chosen by the stockholders of the company. Vacancies were to be filled by the councilors, who were also empowered to elect a governor. The new council was at once organized, and Lord de la Ware was governor for life, chosen governor for life. With him were joined in authority Sir Thomas Gates, Sir George Somers, Christopher Newport, Sir Thomas Dale, and Sir Ferdinand Wayneman. 500 emigrants were speedily collected, and in June a fleet of 9 vessels sailed for America. Lord Delaware did not himself accompany the expedition, but delegated his authority to Somers, Gates, and Newport. In July, the ships then in the West Indies were scattered by storm. One vessel was wrecked, and another, having on board the commissioners of Delaware, was driven ashore on one of the Bermudas. The other 7 ships came safely to Jamestown. Captain Smith continued in authority under the old Constitution, but the colony was in an uproar. The president was in a daily peril of his life. He put some of the most rebellious brawlers in prisoners, and then, in order to distract the attention of the rest, planned 2 new settlements, one of 120 men at Nansemond, the other of the same number at the Falls of the James. Both companies behaved badly. In a few days after their departure, troubles arose with the Indians. While attempting to quell these difficulties, Smith was wounded by the explosion of a bag of gunpowder. Despairing of relief under the imperfect medical treatment which the colony afforded, he decided to return to England. He accordingly delegated his authority to Sir George Percy, and about the middle of September 1609 left the scene of his toils and sufferings, never to return. A colony of 490 persons remained at Jamestown. Such was the bad management after Smith's departure that the settlement was soon brought face to face with starvation. The Indians became hostile. Stragglers were murdered. Houses were set on fire. Disease returned to add to the desolation. And cold and hunger made the winter long remembered as the starving time. By the last of March, only 60 persons were left alive. Meanwhile, Sir Thomas Gates and his companions, who had been shipwrecked in the Bermudas, constructed 2 small vessels and set sail for Virginia. They came in expectation of a joyful greeting. What was their disappointment when a few wan, half-starved wretches crawled out of the cabins to beg for bread. Whatever stores the commissioners had brought with them were distributed to the settlers, and Gates assumed control of the government. But the colonists had now determined to abandon the place forever. In vain did the commissioners remonstrate. They were almost driven to yield to the common will. An agreement was made to sail for Newfoundland, and on the 8th of June, Jamestown was abandoned. The disheartened settlers were anxious to burn the town, but Gates prevented them from doing so. Embarking in their 4 boats, the colonists dropped down with the river, and it seemed that the enterprise of Raleigh and Gosnold had ended in a failure. Lord Delaware was already on his way to America. Before the escaping settlers had reached the sea, the ships of the governor came in sight. He brought additional immigrants, plentiful supplies, and promise of better things. The colonists reluctantly consented to return, and before nightfall, the fires were again kindled at Jamestown. On the next day, the governor caused his commission to be read, and entered upon the discharge of his duties. His amiability and virtue, no less than the wisdom of his administration, endeared him to all and inspired the colony with hope. Lord Delaware was compelled, on account of ill health, to return to England. His authority was delegated to Percy, who had been the deputy of Captain Smith. The superior council had already dispatched a new shipload of stores and another company of immigrants under Sir Thomas Dale. When the vessel arrived at Jamestown, Percy was superseded by Dale, who adopted a system of martial law as the basis of his administration. In the latter part of August, Sir Thomas Gates arrived with a fleet of 6 ships, having on board 300 additional immigrants and a large quantity of stores. Thus far, the property of the settlers at Jamestown had been held in common. The colonists had worked together, and in time of harvest deposited their products in public storehouses. Now the right of holding private property was recognized. Governor Gates had the lands divided so that each settler should have 3 acres of his own. Every family might cultivate a garden and plant an orchard, the fruits of which no one but the owner was allowed to gather. The benefits of the system of labor were at once apparent, and the laborers became cheerful and industrious. Recapitulation. King James grants a new charter. Changes are made in the government. A new council is organized. Delaware is chosen governor. His associates, a fleet with immigrants, sails for America, encounters a storm. 2 vessels are wrecked. 7 ships reach Jamestown. The commissioners are left on the Bermudas. Smith retains the presidency. New settlements are projected. Smith is wounded, returns to England. Colony suffers after his departure. The starving time. Gates and his companions reach Virginia. The settlement is abandoned. Delaware meets the colony and persuades them to return. Prosperity begins. Delaware falls sick and returns to England. Percy is deputy. Dale arrives as governor, brings immigrants. New colonists arrive. The colony improves. Gates is made governor. The right of private property is recognized. Wow. So, what year is this? 1609 is when they granted that. So, it probably wasn't too far after that. So, it was in the 1600s they started to recognize private property for once. And the benefits of the system of labor were at once apparent, and the laborers became cheerful and industrious. That's so interesting to me. All right, let's mark this one. We'll do one more. Chapter 11. Get a drink here. What are we looking on this thing? Oh, yeah. Okay. Do chapter 11 now. Chapter 11. Virginia, the Third Charter. In the year 1612, the London Company obtained from the king a third patent, by which the character of the government was again changed. The Superior Council was abolished, and the stockholders were authorized to elect their own officers and to govern the colony on their own responsibility. The cause of this change was the unprofitableness of the colony and the dissatisfaction of the company with the management of the council. The new patent was a great step toward a democratic form of government in Virginia. In 1613, while Captain Samuel Argall was on expedition up the Potomac, he learned that Pocahontas was residing in that neighborhood. With the help of an Indian family, the captain enticed the girl on board his vessel and carried her captive to Jamestown. The authorities of the colony decided that Powhatan should pay a heavy ransom for his daughter's liberation. The old king indignantly refused and ordered his tribes to prepare for war. Meanwhile, Pocahontas was converted to the Christian faith and became a member of the Episcopal Church. Soon afterward, John Rolfe, a worthy young man of the colony, sought the hand of the princess in marriage. Powhatan and his chiefs gave their consent, and the nuptials were celebrated in the spring of the next year. By this means, a bond of union was established between the Indians and the whites. 2 years later, Rolfe and his wife went to England, where they were received with great respect. Captain Smith gave them a letter of introduction to Queen Anne, and many attentions were bestowed on the modest daughter of the western wilderness. In the following year, while Rolfe was making preparations to return to America, Pocahontas fell sick and died. There was left of his marriage a son who came to Jamestown and was a man of some importance in the colony. To him, several families of Virginians still trace their origins. John Randolph of Roanoke was a descendant of Pocahontas. Captain Argall was next sent with an armed vessel to the coast of Maine. The objective of the voyage was to protect the English fishermen and to destroy the colonies of France, if any should be found within the territory claimed by England. The French authorities of Acadia were at this time building a village near the mouth of Penobscot. This settlement was pillaged and the houses burned. Part of the inhabitants were sent to France and the rest carried to the Chesapeake. The French colony at the mouth of the St. Croix was next attacked, and the fort cannonaded and destroyed. At Port Royal, Argall burned the hamlet, which Poutrincourt had built there 8 years before. On his way back to Virginia, he fell upon the Dutch of Manhattan Island and destroyed their huts and compelled the settlers to acknowledge the King of England. By these outrages, the French settlements in America were confined to the banks of the St. Lawrence. In March of 1614, Sir Thomas Gates returned to England, leaving the government in the hands of Dale. In these times, the laws of the colony were much improved, and the colonial industry took a better form. Hitherto, the settlers had engaged in planting vineyards and in the manufacture of soap, glass, and tar. The managers of the company had at last learned that these articles could be produced more cheaply in Europe than in America. They had also discovered that the products of the New World might be raised and exported with great profit. The chief of these products was the tobacco plant, the use of which had become fashionable in Spain, England, and France. This then became the leading staple of the colony and was even used for money. So entirely did the settlers give themselves to the cultivation of the weed, that the streets of Jamestown were plowed up and planted with it. In 1617, the unprincipled Captain Argall was elected governor. His administration was marked by fraud and violence. When the news of his proceedings reached England, emigration ceased, and Lord Delaware embarked for Virginia in the hope of restoring order. But the worthy nobleman died on the voyage, and Argall continued in office. In 1619, he was last displaced, and Sir George Yeardley appointed to succeed him. Martial law was now abolished. Taxes were repealed, and the people freed from many burdens. Another action was taken of still greater importance. Governor Yeardley divided the plantation into 11 districts, called boroughs, and ordered the citizens of each borough to elect 2 of their number to take part in the government. The elections were duly held, and on the 30th of July, 1619, the Virginia House of Burgesses was organized, the first popular assembly in the New World. In this body was freedom of debate, but very little political power. The year 1619 was also marked by the introduction of slavery. The servants of Jamestown had hitherto been English or Germans, whose terms of service had varied from a few months to many years. No perpetual servitude had thus far been recognized. In the month of August, a Dutch man-of-war sailed up the river to the plantations and offered by auction 20 Africans. They were purchased by the wealthier class of planters and made slaves for life. There were now 600 men in the colony, but they were, for the most part, rovers who intended to return to England. Very few families had emigrated, and society in Virginia was rude and coarse. In this condition of affairs, Sir Thomas Smith was superseded by Sir Edwin Sandys, a man of prudence and integrity. A reformation of abuses was at once begun and carried out. In the summer of 1620, the new treasurers succeeded in sending to America a company of 1,261 persons. Among the number were 90 young women of good breeding and modest manners. In the following spring, 60 others of similar good character came over and received a hearty welcome. When Sandys sent these women to America, he charged the colonists with the expense of the voyage, a measure made necessary by the fact the company was bankrupt. An assessment was made according to the number who were brought over, and the rate fixed at 120 pounds of tobacco for each passenger, a sum which the settlers cheerfully paid. There were merry marriages at Jamestown, and the social condition of the colony was much improved. When the second shipload came, the cost of transportation was fixed at 150 pounds for each passenger, which was also paid without complaint. In July of 1621, the London Company gave to Virginia a code of written laws framed according to the English Constitution. The governor of the colony was to be appointed by the company, a council to be chosen by the same body, and a house of burgesses to be elected by the people. In making laws, the councilors and burgesses sat together. When a new law was proposed, it was debated, and if passed, received the governor's signature, and was then sent to England to be ratified. The Constitution acknowledged the right of petition and of trial by jury, and the burgesses were given the power of vetoing the acts of the company. In October 1621, Sir Francis Wyatt, who had been commissioned as governor, brought the new Constitution of Virginia. The colony was found in a flourishing condition. The settlements were extended for 140 miles along the banks of James River and far into the interior. But the Indians had grown jealous of the colonists and determined to destroy them before it should be too late. Circumstances favored the savages in their meditated treachery. Pocahontas was dead. The peaceful Powhatan had likewise passed away. Opechancanough, who succeeded him in 1618, had long been plotting the destruction of the English, and the time had come for the tragedy. Until the very day of the massacre, the Indians continued on terms of friendship with the colonists. They came into the settlements, ate with their victims, borrowed goats and guns, and gave no token of hostility. On the 22nd day of March, at midday, the work of butchery began. Every hamlet in Virginia was attacked by the barbarians. Men, women, and children were indiscriminately slaughtered, until 347 had perished under the hatchets of savages. But Indian treachery was thwarted by Indian faithfulness. A converted red man, wishing to save the Englishman who had been his friend, went to him on the night before the massacre and revealed the plot. The alarm was spread among the settlements, and thus the greater part of the colony escaped destruction. But the outer plantations were entirely destroyed. The people crowded together on the larger farms about Jamestown, until of the 80 settlements there were only 8 remaining. Still, there were 1,600 brave men in the colony, and sorrow soon gave place to vengeance. Parties of English soldiers scoured the country, burning villages and killing every savage that fell in their way, until the tribes were driven into the wilderness. The colonists, regaining their confidence, returned to their farms, and the next year the population increased to 2,500. The liberal Constitution of Virginia soon proved offensive to King James, and he determined to obtain control of the London Company or suppress it altogether. A committee was appointed to look into the affairs of the corporation and report on its management. The commissioners performed their duty and reported that the company was unsound in its principles, that the treasury was bankrupt, and that the government of Virginia was very bad. Legal proceedings were now instituted against the company, and the judges decided that the patent was null and void. The charter of the corporation was accordingly canceled by the king, and in June of 1624, the London Company ceased to exist. But its work had been well done. A torch of liberty had been lighted on the banks of the James, which all the tyranny of after times could not extinguish. Recapitulation. The London Company receives a third patent. The colony, unprofitable. Argyle kidnaps Pocahontas, who is married to Rolfe. They visit England and leave descendants in Virginia. Argyle destroys the French settlements in Acadia, subdues the Dutch of Manhattan. Dale becomes governor. Tobacco is the staple of Jamestown, is used for money. Argyle is chosen governor. Delaware sails for America and dies. Yeardley supersedes Argyle, abolishes martial law, establishes the House of Burgesses. Slavery is introduced. Society is low. Women are sent over and married to the colonists. A constitution is granted. Wyatt becomes governor. Settlements spread abroad. The Indians become jealous and massacre the people, but are defeated, and the company is opposed by the king. A commission is appointed, and the company's charter is revoked. But liberty is planted in Virginia. Man, that's good stuff, dude. Whoever's listening. Like, a torch of liberty had been lighted on the banks of the James, which all the tyranny of after times could not extinguish. You're not taught ideas like that in school anymore. You're taught some bull crap. You're not taught any kind of value, something to stand up for. Like, this is to teach people like what people stood up for. At least that's how I see it. I don't know. How big's the next one? Ooh. Yeah, we'll stop there for now on chapter 11. We'll come back to 12 at another time. That's good. See the book. This old book. It's awesome. I hope you guys are enjoying it if you're watching. I will be back. Peace out.